Now it's time to introduce our honorable speaker, Mr. Luis Miguel Cardozo from Polytechnic Institution of Portugal and Center Comparative Studies University of Lebanon, Portugal. We feel happy to have you in this memorable meeting, sir. Now, with no time, I hand over the session to Speaker Mr. Luis Miguel Cardozo.
Hello, greetings. It's good morning here from Portugal. Good afternoon to you, my dear friends and my dear colleagues. It's a great pleasure to be here, a great honor to be here at this great conference with extraordinary speakers. First of all, I would like to thank the very kind invitation to participate, to collaborate. And I hope we can have an interesting dialogue about the connections and the boundaries regarding literature and film studies as one of the most interesting approaches regarding culture. So I would like to begin by share my presentation. I hope everything goes smoothly. So would you kindly confirm if the presentation is visible, please?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. So, my dear friends, my dear colleagues, one of the most interesting domains about cultural boundaries, frontiers, and semiotic connections leads us to dialogues between literature and cinema. Of course, when we study history and when we analyze the connections between literature and cinema, we come across an idea that is absolutely, well, not just valid and pertinent and important, but valuable to understand these connections. All begins when we are talking about the first stages of cinema, and we are talking about the first films made by the Lumiere brothers and by Georges Méliès. And of course, when Georges Méliès begins the adaptations of different novels, namely from Jules Verne, then we begin a journey between literature and cinema. So this journey, my dear friends, is all about connecting text, images, and sounds. This is why we have here a paradox. Well, adaptations, of course, are a set of transformations, are a metamorphosis between the original text, the written text, the novel, and the film. So the first question that we may ask is, where do we begin with? Should we watch the film? Should we read the novel? Well, my dear friends, these are two very important tasks in culture: reading, writing, watching, seeing. These verbs are very important, quite different. And we have to think that everything is common between literature and cinema regarding language, regarding text, regarding the connections about authorship, for example. But of course, we have to understand that we have a lot of differences. So this is quite a paradox to handle. So let's begin a journey about this paradox and about the connections and all that separates, that puts apart literature and cinema. So, of course, as an introduction, we should say that literary and film studies have a common basis. And this common basis is narratology. So when we compare a narratological approach regarding a novel, for example, a narratological approach regarding a film, for example, we try to highlight how this novel, this particular novel, was changed into images, how the film maker, how the director approached the written text and transformed it into images. For example, I'm sure we all know Gone with the Wind. I'm sure a lot of you, my dear colleagues and friends, have seen the film, and I'm sure a lot of you have read the novel. And of course, you spotted differences. So this is not a problem, this is not an issue, this is something that is natural. But we have different levels of analyzing these differences between what is literary and what is um, all about creation and film industry. So we have here a lot of crossroads. And of course, the crossroads that connect literary studies and film studies, and even the relationship between literature and art studies, all art studies, are of course a question of adaptation. And adaptation is a huge and complex concept. So adaptation still attracts researchers nowadays that try to understand the boundaries between novels and films, the connections, the way how we can approach the written text and how we can transform it into into something quite different that has text, that has images, and that has sound. So we have here two semiotic systems. When we are talking about literature, we have one semiotic system. When we are talking about film, we have another semiotic system. So this means that we are creating communication in a different way. So when we try to compare these two semiotic systems, of course, we discover analogies, we discover similarities, but we also discover characteristics that are quite different. So we have to understand these points of view, and we have to understand that adaptation is a complex matter. So it is important to highlight what some authors say, what some researchers have said about these connections between literature and cinema. So I will share today a short journey, a small journey, short journey about some of the most important researchers that have studied these connections between literature and cinema. And of course, we will begin by an historical approach regarding the evolution of the concept. Because this concept of the paradox of adaptations is quite difficult to manage. So on one hand, we have the definition of adaptation. So we have a lot of definitions that address the phenomenon of adaptation according to different levels, according to different domains, scientific domains. And of course, we can analyze a film, for example, when we try to connect the story with history, with philosophy, with sociology, with geography, because cinema is all this. Cinema is something quite extraordinary, because in cinema we have all mankind's history. We have our past, we have our present, and we have our future. So we can find out all about, for example, what was happening during the Middle Ages, during the Roman Empire, and we can analyze how is our world today with contemporary cinema, and we can even have a vision of how our future can be created or can become part of us when, for example, we take a look at the sci-fi film. So, on the other hand, we can find a lot of proposals for this narrative approach. We have different paths that try to understand these countless studies about the phenomenon of adaptation. So I have here just a few. For example, we have Wagner in 1975, Synergy in 86, Peña Arlit in 2009, Morissette in 1985, Garcia in 20, Chapman in 20, Corrigan 99, and more recently, one of the most recent studies by Kitchens, Krebs, and Voigt in 2018. So we have a list of different studies that analyze these connections between literature and cinema that establish different guidelines, establish different levels of analysis regarding literature and cinema. So let's take a look at the first typology. So the first attempt to create a typology regarding adaptations was made by George Bluestone in 1957. So in 1957, he wrote novels into film, and this is a classic study. And he proposed 6 examples of adaptations. So he chose some films that he considered the most adequate ones to describe these categories. So first of all, we have The Informer, which exemplifies the director's work in exteriorizing subjective states. Then we have Wuthering Heights. It's an example of a 19th century English novel that you all know that is adapted to a 20th century American audience. So we have here a difference between the first novel, the original narrative, and the adaptation, of course. Then we have Pride and Prejudice. So this is a film inspired by a novel that reveals a lot of similarities with the script, the film script, and explores those similarities. So we have The Grapes of Wrath. I'm sure you all know. So this film illustrates the process of changing the novel's basic sequences, modifying the narrative structure that is evident in the book in order to fill the specific needs of the film approach that is created by the film director. And then we have the Oxbow Incident, a very interesting film, an adaptation that is an example of the way that we can change the end of the narrative to convey a different meaning, to convey a different idea that is quite different from the novel. And last but not least, we have Madame Bovary, an example, and these words are, of course, from George Bluestone's novels into films. This is an example of a failure due to the lack of using spatial elements of the novel, from the novel, and the fact that the director did not think, did not analyze the book in a visual way. So for George Bluestone, Madame Bovary is an example of a failure. So, my dear friends, the paradox begins with this very pessimistic view from Bluestone regarding the connections between literature and cinema. So he concludes one of his chapters by comparing novels and films, and by saying that what is quite characteristic in a film cannot be portrayed exactly, has a phenomenon of close connections regarding a novel. So what really happens is when a film director is trying to adapt a novel, he will destroy a part of the original novel. So this is all about one of the key elements in this book, Novels into Film, that is the question of fidelity. So according to George Bluestone, fidelity is the number one option we have to analyze the connections between literature and cinema. But of course, fidelity is also a very complex problem, issue, challenge. You can choose the word that fits here. And I'm sure we'll agree that it's a great challenge to define the connections between literature and cinema just by saying that the film is faithful to the book. So these challenges are, of course, addressed by George Bluestone, again in Madame Bovary. And of course, we have a lot of films about this novel, that is a very important novel, of course. And one of the most interesting adaptations was made in 1949. So this adaptation that is considered a failure by George Bluestone, and why it is a failure? Because according to this author, on one hand, it is possible to a certain extent to transpose the text to the screen, through the camera. There are certain characteristics of the novel that do not facilitate the adaptation process, so we have difficulties over here, such as the nuance related to meals and why meals are so important when we are reading Madame Bovary, because meals can give us a feeling of monotony that is permanent, a void that characterizes our characters, and a sense of emptiness. And this is a very important detail during the narrative of Madame Bovary. And of course, the film director could not catch all these very important topics, very important ideas from the novel, and get all this to his film. That is absolutely impossible. So he decided not to create a metamorphosis regarding the meals that are portrayed in the novel, and we have here a different approach. So for Bluestone, this is a failure. Of course, we have different models. We talked about the first one by George Bluestone. We have, for example, a second model that I would like to highlight. Of course, we have a lot of other models between Bluestone and Jeffrey Wagner. But Jeffrey Wagner in 1975 wrote the novel and cinema. So here we have a different approach. We have here an approach that connects novels and films, but of course also highlights that we have to understand that a book is a book and a film is a film. So these are different forms of art, and they are independent. So we have to establish that they are different, that they have characteristics that are different. But of course, we can compare and we can analyze this comparison. For example, D.W. Griffith knew from the early age to take advantage of many characteristics, many potentialities that the written texts offered him. because he was inspired by a lot of authors when he was creating his first films. And we have a lot of narratological options from these films that he portrayed in cinema. So in 75, Wagner addresses three possible forms of adaptation: transposition, commentary, and analogy. About transposition, well, he uses Wuthering Heights in 1984 as an example, as examples. Commentary, the Harris and the Clockwork Orange are great examples. And analogy, Candide and Death in Venice are also great examples. So when we have transposition, so this means that we have a new instrument to express content already known. When we have commentary, our film director, reveals a different intention in relation to his literary source. And when we have analogy, we have the original text that is a starting point, but also we have innovations just like changes of place, of time, but we still see and we can still discover a clear link between written source. So these are three levels of adaptation according to Wagner, and this famous book that was published in 75. In 93, another author called Louis Jagnetti gave us another portrait about connections between literature and cinema. And of course, he addressed the complex issue of fidelity. So the starting point for this typology is to address different levels regarding adaptation. So we have here, for example, free adaptation, faithful adaptation, and literal adaptation. So free adaptation is when we have an appropriation of a situation, an idea, or character from a literary source that is developed in an independent way. A faithful adaptation tries to recreate the literary text, keeping the spirit of the book as much as possible. And then we have the literal adaptation. And the literal adaptation is, of course, majority of literal adaptations are adaptations inspired by theater. So this is why we have here King Lear, because we can use the dialogues and action and the structure of the play and bring all this to our film. So, my dear friends, conclusions about the connections between literature and cinema, about the paradox of adaptations, and of course, we only highlighted some major authors. We have a lot of authors that analyze these connections. So we should say that when we think about when and why cinema became a great industry, a big industry, so cinema brought us new opportunities to connect our narrative with written models. So we have, of course, new techniques that can improve our relation with film industry, but we are still today using literature as a major source for ideas, for characters, for stories. Still today, we have a lot of films that are adaptations, and we love good adaptation, don't we? So films, of course, have also been greatly influenced by literature, and literature has also received influences from cinema, because we have, for example, writers who became film directors. And we have, for example, film directors who became novelists. And then we have these boundaries that are very difficult to establish between these expressions of art. And of course, adapting a novel is first not just an exercise of a translation, it's not just translating words into a succession of moving pictures telling a story. It's much more than this. So, of course, when we analyze an adaptation, we could choose the word fidelity, but today it's no longer the most important word that we can choose to analyze these connections. So we have to understand that the book is the origin, is the starting point, but of course, the film director has all the possibilities of making changes about characters, time, space, action, and neurological approaches. And this is also one of the aspects that we have to consider that is, of course, valid pertinent in the adaptation studies, because film directors must have liberty, must be independent, must be able to create a new form of art from the written text. So, my dear friends and my dear colleagues, of course, when we think about adaptations, we think about this very interesting challenge that is to understand how novels and films are connected. And I'm sure we will still have this debate for a long time because literature will continue to inspire film industry. So again, my friends, it was a great pleasure to be here. I thank the organizing committee. My congratulations to the organizing committee. It is a great conference, quality conference, great speakers. And of course, again, would like to say that it was great for me to be here. So thanks for inviting me, and I hope we can meet in the next conference. Thank you.